From the moment SHEDEUR Sanders entered the Cleveland spotlight, the environment around him was unstable. Coaching changes, locker room tension, and front office inconsistency created a perfect storm. But somehow, Jason Lloyd chose to zero in on Sanders. Ken Carman, fed up with the misdirection, broke it down. This isn't about quarterback play. It's about deflection. Sanders isn't the problem. He's the easy headline. Carman draws a clear line between chaos and the front office. If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed. And the scapegoating of a young player still finding his footing. Instead of addressing the real issues, team structure, leadership gaps, systemic media patterns, critics like Lloyd deflect responsibility towards Sanders. Carman's stance isn't just a defense of talent. It's a demand for transparency in how we talk about athletes and flawed systems. This entire situation blows up the moment Ken Carman decides he's had enough. He's not hedging. He's not softening the language. He's speaking plainly, and that's what makes it land. Carman is calling out what he sees as a pattern, not a one-off bad take, not a disagreement over football mechanics, but a consistent, targeted approach toward one player, SHEDEUR Sanders. And Carman makes it clear this isn't about protecting a quarterback from criticism. It's about how that criticism is being delivered, and why it always seems to land heavier on the same shoulders. Carman frames the issue directly. He says the conversation around Sanders stopped being football a long time ago. The analysis isn't about reads, progressions, or development. It's about framing, tone, assumptions. Carman argues that Sanders is being talked about as a problem before he's even allowed to be a project. And that matters because narratives stick. Once a player gets labeled, every throw gets filtered through that label. What Carman emphasizes is context. A young quarterback walking into organizational instability, media pressure, and constant scrutiny doesn't get the benefit of patience. And Carman's frustration isn't hidden. He says what a lot of fans have been thinking, but haven't heard said out loud on Cleveland airwaves. That this feels personal, that it feels excessive, and that it's being driven by voices that claim objectivity while pushing a very specific story. Jason Lloyd becomes a focal point because Carman believes he represents a larger problem in Cleveland sports media. According to Carman, Lloyd's commentary goes past performance critique and into narrative building. The issue isn't that Lloyd criticizes Sanders. It's how often, how aggressively, and how selectively that criticism appears. Mistakes get magnified. Positives get minimized. Neutral moments get spun. Carman argues that when Lloyd talks about Sanders, the framing is rarely generous and almost never patient. A missed throw becomes a referendum on leadership. A learning curve becomes a character flaw. Carman calls this out as irresponsible, especially when dealing with a young quarterback still adjusting to the league and the organization around him. The accusation isn't subtle. Carman says this kind of coverage doesn't exist in a vacuum. It shapes how fans talk. It shapes how callers react. It shapes how a player is perceived before they ever get a fair runway. And when one voice dominates that framing, it creates an echo chamber where criticism feeds on itself. Carman also points out how rarely the same tone is applied elsewhere. Organizational dysfunction doesn't get the same heat. Coaching uncertainty doesn't dominate the conversation. Instead, the quarterback becomes a lightning rod, and Carman says that's not accidental. At the center of all of this is SHEDEUR Sanders himself, who, according to Carman, has been forced to carry expectations and blame that far outweigh his actual role. Sanders hasn't created the Browns' instability. He didn't design the roster. He didn't create the media environment. Yet he's being talked about as if he's responsible for everything that goes wrong. Carman pushes back on the idea that Sanders is somehow failing by default. He notes that Sanders has shown resilience, composure, and flashes of real ability. Those moments don't get ignored entirely, but they get buried under louder criticism. And Carman says that imbalance is the problem. There's also the issue of scrutiny. Carman argues that Sanders is judged on things other quarterbacks aren't. Body language, tone, confidence. Things that often get rebranded as arrogance or immaturity when attached to a young black quarterback. Carman doesn't dance around this point. He says this is part of a long-standing pattern in sports media, and Sanders is just the latest example. What frustrates Carman most is that Sanders hasn't pushed back publicly. He hasn't made excuses. He hasn't blamed teammates. He's done what young quarterbacks are told to do: work, learn, show up, and yet the narrative keeps tightening around him. Carman references how Sanders handles himself publicly, especially in press settings. Calm, controlled, professional. There's no chaos there, no soundbite hunting, no controversy. And that's what makes the media narrative feel even more forced. According to Carman, when reporters go fishing for drama, Sanders doesn't give it to them. He answers questions directly. He acknowledges mistakes without self-destruction. That should matter. But Carman says it rarely gets acknowledged because it doesn't fit the story some people want to tell. This is where Carman leans into the ethics of journalism. He says reporting should be grounded in fairness, not confirmation bias. If a player gives you nothing inflammatory, you shouldn't manufacture it. If the locker room isn't imploding, you shouldn't hint that it is. Carman argues that repeatedly suggesting problems without evidence doesn't just mislead fans. It puts unnecessary pressure on a developing player. And when that pressure is unevenly applied, it raises real questions about motive. Carman widens the lens to the Browns as an organization. Coaching changes, shifting priorities, uncertainty at multiple levels. He argues that these factors matter far more than any single quarterback performance, yet they're often treated as background noise. The Browns' instability creates an easy scapegoat. When things don't click, it's easier to point at the quarterback than to unpack deeper issues. Carman says this has been happening for years in Cleveland, and Sanders is just the latest to feel it. What makes this different, Carman says, is how quickly the blame arrived. Sanders hasn't been given time to settle. He hasn't been allowed normal development mistakes. Every misstep is treated like confirmation rather than part of growth. Carman insists that fair analysis would acknowledge the chaos around Sanders instead of pretending he exists in isolation. Football doesn't work that way, and pretending it does only serves bad narratives. Performance is where Carman draws a clear line. He says you can criticize plays, you can critique decisions. That's football. But you also have to acknowledge what Sanders has done well: the throws, the reads, the poise under pressure. Carman notes that Sanders has shown traits teams look for in quarterbacks: leadership, confidence, mental toughness. Those don't disappear because of a rough stretch or organizational noise. What Carman objects to is the selective memory. When Sanders succeeds, it's treated as an outlier. When he struggles, it's treated as a pattern. That imbalance distorts reality. Carman stresses that evaluating Sanders based on actual performance means accepting that his story is still being written. Writing the ending early doesn't make it true. The relationship between the quarterback and coaching staff is another area Carman says gets misrepresented. There's no evidence of dysfunction, no visible breakdown. Yet whispers keep circulating. Carman argues that this kind of speculation is lazy and harmful. It suggests drama without proof and feeds the same narrative loop. Sanders is framed as difficult or incompatible without anything tangible to support it. Carman says accountability should apply to media voices as much as players. If you're going to suggest problems, you better have facts. Otherwise, you're just selling. Carman closes his argument by reminding listeners that Sanders' story isn't finished. Young quarterbacks aren't finished products. They're works in progress. Treating them like failures before they've had a fair chance says more about the environment than the player. He calls on media members to do better, to evaluate fairly, to acknowledge bias when it shows up, to remember the power they hold in shaping perception. Carman isn't asking for protection. He's asking for balance, for integrity, for criticism rooted in reality, not assumption. And for fans watching all of this unfold, it's a reminder to question the loudest voices, to look at performance, to understand context, to recognize when a narrative is being pushed instead of reported. If you think this conversation matters, make sure you support content that values fairness over clicks. Share your thoughts, talk about it, and stay connected for more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you stand in the comments. As the conversation grows louder, Sanders stays consistent. He doesn't clap back on social media. He doesn't drop cryptic messages. He shows up, speaks calmly, and keeps it professional. And that restraint is part of why Carman feels so strongly about the imbalance in media coverage. Sanders isn't adding fuel to the fire, but he keeps getting burned anyway. Carman points out that even when Sanders has addressed the media, his comments are picked apart for tone or phrasing. A young quarterback showing confidence is branded as cocky. A moment of frustration becomes a character flaw. These aren't isolated interpretations, they're patterns. And Carman says they align with how black quarterbacks have historically been treated by the media. He highlights how much pressure it takes just to stay focused in an environment like this. It's one thing to be critiqued on film. It's another to feel like every word you say could become the next headline. That's the weight Sanders is carrying. And it's not about protecting him from accountability. It's about asking why the accountability bar keeps moving depending on who you are. Back on Jason Lloyd, Carman doesn't let up. He says Lloyd's coverage doesn't just reflect personal opinion. It sets the tone. He's got the platform, the access, and the reputation. That kind of reach comes with responsibility, and Carman believes it's being misused. What's more frustrating for Carman is the selective outrage. He argues that when Sanders makes a mistake, Lloyd's coverage zeroes in with surgical precision. But when the Browns as a whole falter, the tone softens. The blame gets distributed. The quarterback, though, keeps ending up at the center of the storm. It's not about silencing critics. It's about making sure the criticism is fair and consistent. Carman says Lloyd's commentary feels like it's searching for reasons to be disappointed. And when that energy is applied week after week, it builds a narrative that becomes hard to shake. That's how reputations get shaped in sports media. Not through one article or one, but through a steady stream of framing that reinforces the same idea. In this case, the idea that SHEDEUR Sanders is a liability. Carman says that's not just unfair, it's damaging. The numbers don't tell a story of disaster. Sanders has had rookie mistakes, sure, but he's also had moments that show real talent. Solid reads, tight throws, poise and broken plays. Carman makes a point of highlighting these, not to sugarcoat, but to rebalance. He says it's not that Sanders is perfect. It's that the standards being applied to him seem designed for him to fail. When he plays well, the conversation shifts to whether it's sustainable. When he struggles, it's proof he's not ready. That no-win framing is part of what Carman is fighting against. Carman even points out how similar performances from other young quarterbacks are often given more patience. They're labeled as raw, developing, promising with some work to do. But with Sanders, those qualifiers disappear. Every critique sounds final. That's the double standard. And Carman isn't afraid to call it out, especially when the film shows improvement, effort, and commitment. Traits that should be celebrated in any young player trying to make his way in the NFL. Carman's tone through all of this is one of frustration, but it's rooted in care for the sport and the city. He wants media voices to be better because he knows their impact. He's not here to cancel anyone. He's here to push back against a tide that feels wrong. He explains that the media doesn't just reflect opinions. It builds them. When reporters start implying locker room friction or internal tension without clear evidence, fans begin to treat that as fact. The narrative calcifies. And once it happens, it's hard to undo. Carman says he's seen it before. Promising players swallowed by storylines they didn't create. He doesn't want that for Sanders. He doesn't want that for Cleveland. This city has been through enough quarterback drama. It doesn't need another media-manufactured meltdown. His challenge is clear. Be fair, be honest, and don't let personal bias drive coverage. Because when media members start becoming characters in the story rather than observers, something gets lost, and it's usually the truth. In Sanders' press conferences, Carman finds a mirror to his argument. A young quarterback, standing at the mic, answering every question with professionalism. He owns his mistakes. He praises teammates. He keeps it focused. There's no finger-pointing, no drama, and yet somehow those same sessions get spun into signs of trouble. A clipped response becomes attitude. A confident answer becomes ego. Carman asks, how is this a takeaway? He says that if someone else with a different background were standing at that podium, the interpretation would be different. Leadership maturity, swagger. But with Sanders, the default lens is suspicion. That's why Carman doesn't let it slide. He says the media needs to check itself. The standards have to be the same across the board, because otherwise it stops being coverage. It becomes character assassination. The Browns themselves aren't immune from Carman's criticism either. He says the organization hasn't done enough to protect its young quarterback from this kind of noise. Mixed messaging, shaky support, and vague public statements have left Sanders out in the open. When you have a rookie quarterback, Carman argues, you build a wall around him, at least for a while. You let him grow. You help him find footing. But what he's seen instead is a team that's let the media run wild while staying mostly silent. Carman doesn't think this is intentional neglect, but he does think it's a failure of leadership. Because in a media-heavy market like Cleveland, silence can sound like agreement. And when the stories flying around are this pointed, that silence gets interpreted as complicity. He says the Browns need to own the narrative again, not through spin, through clarity, through presence, through real investment in the guy they put behind center. After games, when tensions run high and emotions are raw, Sanders doesn't flinch. He answers tough questions. He doesn't hide. And Carman says that level of composure from a young quarterback should earn him some benefit of the doubt. But it doesn't, at least not from the usual suspects. Instead, every post-game moment gets dissected for signs of weakness. And when none are found, the tone shifts to speculation. What's really going on in the locker room? Carman says that kind of coverage is cheap. It creates smoke where there's no fire, and it builds pressure on a player who's doing everything right under the circumstances. He doesn't see a quarterback unraveling. He sees one trying to stand tall in a storm not of his making. And the fans? They're noticing. Social media has become a place of pushback. Fans defending Sanders, challenging the narratives, highlighting the growth. That public voice matters. Because when the media gets it wrong, the people watching can help get it right. The Stefanski angle is another piece Carman finds exhausting. Rumors of tension, whispers of disconnect, but no real evidence. Carman says it's narrative building without a foundation. He calls out the leap in logic. Because Sanders is being criticized and Stefanski is the coach, there must be friction. But nobody involved had confirmed that. No on-the-record quotes. No visible drama. Just speculation filling space. Carman says that in a time when young players are already navigating high expectations, the last thing they need is invented controversy with their coaching staff. It's irresponsible, and it creates distractions that shouldn't exist. If there's real tension, Carman says, report it, but don't create it. Don't take a quiet moment and fill it with noise just to feed a cycle. Especially when what the quarterback and coach both need is stability, not whispers of chaos. At this point, Carman's not just questioning Jason Lloyd's takes. He's putting them under a microscope. He doesn't accuse Lloyd of being the only voice with bias, but he makes it clear. Lloyd's platform comes with weight, and that weight has been landing squarely on Sanders' back since day one. It's the language, Carman says. The little jabs. The way doubt is always the default. When Lloyd brings up Sanders, it's not what did he do right or what's developing here. It's how long can the team afford to wait, or is he losing the locker room? Those aren't harmless questions. They steer perception. They plant seeds. And over time, they grow into narratives that stick even when the facts don't support them. Carman's issue is that Lloyd's criticism doesn't feel rooted in performance alone. It's about something else, something harder to prove, but impossible to ignore. And when a young black quarterback is repeatedly put in a hot seat, while broader team failures get a pass, it begs the question, why? This entire saga is what makes SHEDEUR Sanders' quiet consistency so powerful. Under all this noise, he's never lashed out. He hasn't pulled the everyone's against me card. And that's what makes the scrutiny feel even more undeserved. He speaks when he needs to, keeps it measured, talks about learning, getting better, owning the process. And still, the media storm around him refuses to let up. It's like no matter what he does, someone's waiting to twist it into proof that he's not the guy. Carman's argument is clear. If you're going to criticize, do it with the same standards you apply to everyone else. Don't use a different playbook when it comes to Sanders. Don't pretend the noise is just part of the game when it's clearly louder, sharper, and more relentless than it is for other young QBs around the league. So what now? That's the question Carman puts on the table. Not just for media members, but for fans, for the team, for everyone watching this play out. Because this isn't just about one player. It's about the environment we allow to be built around our athletes. It's about whether we let narratives outpace reality, and whether we're brave enough to check the voices shaping those narratives. If you're following this story, now's the time to speak up. Drop a comment if you're seeing the same patterns. Share the video if you're tired of the double standards. And if you're rooting for Sanders to succeed, not because he's perfect, but because he deserves a fair shot, hit that like button and subscribe for more breakdowns like this. The story isn't over, but how we talk about it can change everything.